Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Today, our guest is Seth Berkley. He's an American medical doctor and epidemiologist who's best known for his work in public health and global health. For over a decade, Seth has served as the CEO of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which is responsible for protecting an entire generation of children against some of the most deadly infectious diseases in many of the world's poorest countries. For over a decade, he served as the CEO of Gavi and will be stepping down come August. His successor, Dr. Mohammed Ali Pateh, will be taking over. Dr. Berkley has been instrumental in leading Gavi's efforts to increase immunization coverage and strengthen health systems in developing countries. Gavi was also the leader of COVAX, the COVID Vaccines Global Access Collaboration, and was responsible for shipping almost 2 billion doses of COVID vaccine, which accounted for 3/4 of the COVID vaccine supply in low-income countries. So we're going to be talking a bit about COVID vaccination, as well as immunization of children. Many of us working in public health are frustrated that we're again repeating many of the same mistakes of past pandemics, repeating the cycle of panic and neglect. Why does history keep repeating itself, and is there anything we can do about it?
Well, thanks for the lovely introduction. And let me start by saying, the challenge is that we seem to think of emergencies seriatim rather than together. And it brings me back to the time when Ebola occurred in West Africa, and we had a similar moment where it was on the news, everybody thought it was critical, everybody stepped in, and at the time people said, Seth, whatever you need, money's no object. And 3 months later, when I tried to get financing to set up a stockpile of a successful Ebola vaccine, people said, Ebola, that was yesterday's problem. And of course, since then, we've had many, many more outbreaks of Ebola that have been controlled by a vaccine. And I think the real challenge is if you look at something like defense, people think about prevention, they think about war games, they think about how you can be prepared for what you need to do. For pandemics, they're in the news and then they're out of the news, and we've moved on to Ukraine and we've moved on to global warming and all of the challenges that the world really has. And so we need to restrike a balance that says that global health security is part of national security. It is, after all, the way you will kill more people than any other in probability terms, like we saw with COVID-19, which cost ultimately $12 trillion.
But is there any political will to fund inter-pandemic work when you're not in the middle of a crisis to fund that pandemic preparedness? And how do you generate that will?
Well, I mean, that's the problem. There hasn't been until recently. Now, if you're an optimist, you say, well, there's now a pandemic accord or treaty that's stepping up, and there is a pandemic fund that has been done. But the pandemic fund originally was laid out to be $15 billion a year, and it's raised about $1.75 billion in total. So I think the answer is that there is not the effort that needs to be there. And the critical issue is, it's not like we have to set up some esoteric pandemic preparedness institution. The way to prepare for a pandemic is to do what you're doing now as well as you can. It's building resilient health systems. It's having children and adults vaccinated with existing vaccines, building that capacity. Because at the end, it's not really a global capacity, it's a local capacity that has to deal with it. The US, of course, had the highest score for pandemic preparedness and, of course, did really poorly in its actual implementation of the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic.
And yet, in Congress in the US, just as one example, we're seeing conversations about defunding the CDC, cutting global health programs. How do we convince people, having gone through the COVID pandemic, having seen these trillions of dollars lost to the pandemic, how do we convince them and make the case that this is a worthy investment?
Well, Senator Moynihan said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. And one of the challenges is making sure that we have truth at the center of what we do, because during the pandemic, the number of countries that politicized vaccines, that politicized masks, that politicized the science. It's one thing to say, here's the scientific facts. Now we have to use those differently. We may have to trade off and do other things, and of course that's all legitimate. But when you distort science, where do you go from there? And so some of the debates that are going on is a little bit like cutting off your nose to spite your face. If you were to go ahead and defund an institution like the CDC. Now, the CDC did not perform beautifully. There were certainly problems in its performance, but that doesn't mean you defund it. What you do is go in and reform it and make sure it's better for the inevitability of the next time. We'll by the way, we'll see that we're entering an era of polyepidemics with the population going up, with urbanization, with climate change, movement of vectors, people, desertification, people moving because of this displacement. We're going to see more and more epidemics and pandemics. And so the world absolutely has to be prepared.
So you touched on this issue of facts and alternative facts and disinformation. Over the weekend, I'm sure many here saw some of the controversy about Joe Rogan challenging Peter Hotez to a debate, others chiming in. How do we counter disinformation at this point in time, particularly given what's happened to journalism? So normally, in years past, journalism might have been translating science for the lay public. With the rise of big technology companies, the business model of journalism has really evaporated. And many journalistic institutions are either shuttering or on the decline. In that environment, how do you break through?
It's a challenge. Years ago, I had a list of reporters who knew the subject inside and out and who would stay up to date. And so when something broke, it was really a matter of talking to them about that little change, but they understood all the science behind it. Today, that doesn't exist. And I worry because not only do you have the politicization that's going on, so you have figures that are theoretically authoritative on these issues, but also you have intentional misinformation. So we saw, for example, Russian bots that put out information on vaccines that were pro-vaccine and that were also anti-vaccine at the same time. You say, well, what's the purpose of that? It affects confidence in public institutions, and that's a strategy to try to affect democracy. So the challenge is, if you go to Facebook for all of your information and you live in an ecosystem of people and you start being an anti-vaxxer, that's only going to be accelerated because you're going to hear from other people. And so it is really a challenge. I think my hope, of course, is that this is affecting the broader swaths of the population, and I'm hoping that we will ultimately go back to journalism as a profession, because the thing about journalism is there is opinion side of journalism, and you can have any opinion you want, but there's also the facts behind it, and that separation and that editorial content was really important to having people understand. I'd say lastly, obviously having science literacy is critical. We're living in a world where science is moving quicker and quicker, and how do we make sure that school curriculums teach all children about science? And one of the challenges in that is that, we're banning books, we're deciding which pieces of facts we, can tell or not, or we're saying evolution is a theory and not a fact. I mean, it creeps into the educational system, it creeps into, politics, it creeps into our media, and it's a real problem.
Who's responsible for righting the ship on this, so to speak? We live in a capitalistic society here in the United States. You need a business model to support good information. There's a great business model for disinformation. People make a lot of money off of it. What do you do for good information? Well,
I mean, in the past, you would have some public media as well. I mean, BBC has been a source when I lived in Africa. That was where you got information, or Voice of America in places that didn't have free news areas. NPR, I'm sure many people here at Aspen listen to NPR. So there are public sector funded institutions as well. But I think we have to begin to hold people responsible who put out misinformation. So let me give you an example. If we walked into a crowded movie theater and yelled fire, and some people got trampled and died, I could be held liable for doing that. Now, the argument isn't you've got free speech. this would be considered, harming other people. So if you put on social media information that is known to be false, different from, I don't know, I don't understand, should that be allowed, or should somebody be held liable? Because in my case, people actually die. When, it's a tragedy. When I look at the coverage rate, the US got to about 69% in coverage for COVID vaccines. There were many, many hundreds of thousands of people who died unnecessarily because of the fact that they didn't know. Now, it's their choice. If you know and you choose not to get it, that's a different story. But if you don't know, if you think, no, this isn't good for me, or it doesn't work, or, then that's a real problem. Who bears that responsibility?
So shifting gears a little bit, one of the lessons learned, or you might say was relearned during the pandemic, is it's not enough to have vaccine supply. You also need mechanisms to distribute the vaccine, and you need people to line up for the vaccine, so have demand for the vaccine. In a crisis, how do we ensure quick and efficient and equitable distribution of a vaccine?
So let me start with the developing world, but we can come back to the developed world as well, because it was a problem, obviously, in both places. In the developing world, we actually have pretty good vaccination numbers. Many people don't know that, but we reach about 90% of children in the world with at least one dose of routine vaccine. So there are systems in place that can be used. The challenge, of course, is with all of this misinformation coming and the challenges we had with distribution because of vaccine nationalism and other issues, that made it very difficult to get countries later on to have citizens, line up to do it. And so what we ended up having to do is work country by country. So at the beginning of January of 2022, we had 34 countries that still had less than 10% coverage for COVID-19. And at that point, we had adequate doses for everybody. So what we did is we worked country by country, with the UN agencies, with civil society, with local leaders, religious leaders, to help them move forward. And today, there's only 6 countries in the world that have coverage less than 10%. Many of those countries now have coverage 30, 40, 50, 60%. So they've really stepped up. So it is possible to do it. It just takes a little time and effort. And the challenge is now, can we take the lessons learned in each of those countries and situations and move that forward? Now, one of the challenges for developing countries is they traditionally don't vaccinate adults, they don't vaccinate the elderly. So they had to adapt, and there was a reduction of about 5% of routine coverage because people were pivoting to take care of these much larger vaccine programs. But while coverage went down 5%, countries vaccinated 3 times the number of people they had ever vaccinated in history, which just shows how amazingly resilient those systems were. Now, health workers are burned out. The nurses are, everywhere in the world are bearing this. And so we do need better health care, more staff, all of that. But I think they are the heroes who were able to step up and be able to do that. Now, in the West, we, of course, assumed, it's easy. But you may have heard yesterday, for those that went to it, the session with the HHS directors, they made the point that people don't think about, which is there is no national health system in the US. And so they can put some guidelines out, but at the end, it's state and local, and it was very disorganized and chaotic, and that's a problem when you have an emergency like that. Of course, they got the military involved with getting the vaccine out, but they didn't get the military involved for obvious reasons in arranging the clinics. But how do you make it systematic and have people prepared? This, by the way, was a 1.5% mortality rate, COVID. What if we had a virus that had a 30 or 40 or 50% mortality rate? Imagine the chaos that would ensure. We need to build those systems ahead of time.
You mentioned vaccine nationalism. What do you mean by that exactly, and how did that actually get in the way of vaccination during the pandemic?
So what vaccine nationalism is about is kind of the idea that says, vaccines are for my country, my people, and forget about the rest of the world. Now, I was accused of being naive. You think we're going to give them to everybody when we're not vaccinating ourselves. Of course not. You vote for political leaders, and the job of a political leader is to make sure that you have whatever interventions you need for your country. However, the critical issue in a pandemic is we're only safe if everyone is safe. And I don't think anybody believed it. Every political leader in the world, when we set up COVAX, 193 countries signed up. By the way, the US wasn't one of them at the time. It was the US, Russia, just a couple of others that weren't, but everybody else signed up. And, people talked about it, but they really didn't believe it. It was only when we began to see outbreaks of, Delta in India, and within a month it was everywhere in the world, Omicron coming out of Southern Africa around the world, that people realized in a pandemic, you can't put a wall up, you can't block it, you have to think about what's happening across the world. And that really is the challenge with vaccine nationalism. Of course, if you do vaccine nationalism in the countries that have the vaccine production facilities, what that means is the places that don't have the facilities have no access. And that really meant, lots of lives were lost unnecessarily. We tech transferred vaccines to India for production for the rest of the world. By the way, 50% for India, 50% for the rest of the world. And when India stopped exporting those doses, they had exported about 40 or 50 million, and they stopped exporting those. Many people got their first dose and couldn't get a second dose for about 4 months, and that was a really terrible thing that really changed the balance of power in the vaccine space, where we've had reliable supply for decades now of high-quality, low-cost vaccines for everywhere in the world.
How, when you say change the balance of power, 4 months seems like a pretty short period of time. How did that shift that balance of power?
Well, yes, if you look at the previous pandemic of swine flu, basically 0 doses got to the developing world. And I'll fast forward and say that we ultimately had 55% coverage with primary vaccine in the half of the world that was poorer. So we actually did pretty well, certainly compared to the last time. The challenge is, if you're sitting in a country in a panicked moment, and you all remember what COVID was like. You're in lockdown, and you turn on your television or listen to your radio, and you hear reports of, everywhere around the world, people are lined up and getting their vaccines, and you don't have it. You're angry, and you're saying, why has that happened? Particularly because you got from us a note that says, here's the presumed schedule for vaccines. You'll be receiving doses here, here, and here. All of a sudden, they're gone. So it led to an incredible amount of anger from countries, particularly in Africa, because they were often last on the list because of manufacturers not necessarily prioritizing them to have those vaccines available. And that has now led to a whole new movement that says, and it's a problem, because every country wants to produce their own vaccines. Now, vaccines are hard to produce, and you need large volumes. That's why generally they're produced in countries that have big birth cohort. And so now every country is saying we want them. There are 33, last count, individual programs to produce vaccines in Africa. I mean, you couldn't have 33 new COVID vaccine plants in Africa. They wouldn't survive. But that shows the angst and changing of the balance of power, because before we had 19 facilities kind of supplying the world, and we'll end up somewhere, I don't know, 50, 60, 70, and that's going to change the dynamics of market, supply, and cost, because the 11 vaccines that WHO recommends cost $1,300 in the US. They're not exactly the same, but if you apples for apples comparison, they cost $24 in the developing world through the manufacturing supply we put together. And if those costs start going up, countries won't be able to afford the vaccines, particularly middle-income countries.
Now, some, including PEPFAR Ambassador John Nkengasong, have called for greater self-sufficiency in vaccine production. Ambassador Nkengasong was the head of the Africa Union, CDC, during most of the pandemic. You touched on this, but are there ways in which we can build greater capacity or self-sufficiency for the African continent, for example?
So one of the things that was important, and I worked very closely with John during the whole pandemic, was you need to make sure, if you look at supply, as I said, we had adequate supply, we had adequate producers for the world. But what we didn't have is supply to deal with vaccine nationalism and export bans and supply chain closures. So the hypothesis is bringing vaccine production closer to countries would help with that. Now, it's unknown, because if there's 55 countries in Africa, if you put 5 plants across Africa, will they supply all 55 countries, and will you have the same problem? And as I said, it's implausible to have 55 plants, and even so, you can't produce all of the different types of vaccines, and we don't know what type of vaccine may be needed for the next pandemic. So what we're working on now with the African CDC is to try to create a program that would allow a handful of manufacturers to produce not just the pandemic vaccine, but routine vaccines. Because the way you are a good plant is you have a diversity of production, you have the staff in place, you're making money in peacetime, you're operating in peacetime, and then when a pandemic occurs, you pivot to take care of them. The idea that you create a plant that just sits there and you turn it on, that won't work because you won't have the workers, you won't have the skill set, you won't have the regulatory. So that's what we're working on right now, but it's not a short-term process because what you need is to build the human capacity, the supply chains, the regulatory system, the plants. I mean, the plant's the easy part, it's expensive, but you can build a plant, over the course of a year or two. It's all of those other aspects because at the end, these are complicated biological things we're injecting into healthy people. And if you have a problem in one place, it'll affect the whole world. This is the issue of, fear of vaccines. There's, as I said, some, nefarious people putting misinformation, but there really are people who say, I'm nervous about this. I don't know what's in the vaccine. And if you have a really bad episode, that will have effects across the world.
There's been a lot of discussion around this pandemic treaty, a lot of misconceptions about it. If you could explain what some of those misconceptions are, and also what the impact of the pandemic treaty might be on preparedness for the next big pandemic.
So it's one of the pieces. It's not the only piece, not a magic bullet, but a silver bullet. But what people need to understand, of course, is we don't know where the next pandemic is going to come from. We don't know what country. So one of the things you need is a system that countries will share information, will share data. You need a way, if there are technologies that are good, that those technologies can get shared. You need an ability to send people in to help countries if they need help. And so the idea is having an international order that can help on that, and that's critical for every country in the world, including the wealthiest to the poorest. The misconceptions are around we're giving up our sovereignty. We're all of a sudden, the helicopters or the black helmeted people in the black helicopters are going to come and take over our country, which of course is not what this is about. This is about, right now we have a program, for example, to share influenza. So you get flu in the southern hemisphere, and that flu tends to go then the same strains into the northern hemisphere. So you have enough time to produce the vaccine for the northern hemisphere. It doesn't always work. Sometimes we get mismatchings, but to do that, you have to share strains that are circulating in all the different countries. So that's really what we want to move to, is a level of transparency and openness and being constructive about it. But of course, there are these fears, and that really is a problem, because if we can't do that, then you can imagine a situation, a new disease appears, we don't know what it is, we can't get the best scientists in the world to look at it, but we also then can't make the countermeasures because we don't have the genomic sequences or the actual material to be able to do that. So we need to have those types of situations going.
You mentioned transparency, and also very much in the news and being debated in Congress is the source of the pandemic. How might the pandemic treaty and trying to make all of these processes more transparent, how might that improve our understanding of the source of the pandemic in the future?
Well, it's an interesting question. To me, the critical question, first of all, is this man-made? Is this intentional? Is this bioterrorism? And I think that was pretty clearly shown not to be the case, because you could trace the lineage of the genome back to the genomes that are occurring naturally in bats. So you can say, this is not something that was made in a laboratory. But then the question was, could it have been a naturally occurring strain that was in a laboratory and that got released? And that's certainly possible. Now, from a public health point of view, you'd like to know that because you'd like to obviously tighten up laboratory control mechanisms. But it's not the same implication as if this was a man-made pathogen. what you need to be able to deal with these is having transparency. But this is where the rub is, because imagine the US says, yes, we'd like to be able to go to investigate in China and know what happened in this particular seafood market or in the Wuhan Institute, et cetera. But if there's going to be reciprocity, then you say, China says we want to come to CDC's, special pathogens lab where I used to work, and we want access and be able to look at that. And you can imagine how well that would go over. So these are the difficulties in trying to figure out, and can there be a trusted intermediary that can do that? Now, traditionally, WHO tries to be that. But WHO was horribly politicized. There was a discussion to defund it in the middle of a pandemic, which seemed a little crazy to me because, at the end, it isn't perfect, and there's certainly things that need to be improved. But if we didn't have a WHO, we'd have to try to create a new one. And I think the challenge is getting back to a place where we trust institutions. If they're not doing a good job, by all means, change them, fire the people, move things around. But we have to have that type of global system to be able to know what's going on, and frankly, to go into situations that are emergencies. I mean, in the Ebola situation, I've traveled into, the war-torn zones with, WHO, UNICEF, World Food Program, and others, and, it's amazing what they're doing on the ground. We have to support that type of effort.
Tom Boyke and some of his other colleagues, so he's at the Council on Foreign Relations, has done some really interesting research on trust and how trust, interpersonal trust, so trust between people, trust in government institutions, was a very good predictor, actually, of how different countries fared during the pandemic. You mentioned trust in WHO. How do we rebuild that trust, and how do we incorporate that into pandemic preparedness?
Well, it was interesting. If you listened to the secretaries last night, they talked about the international importance of what they do. And that is, they mentioned that as a critical part of American diplomacy and scientific expertise, et cetera. That is the way you build trust. Now, I worked at the Centers for Disease Control. As I said, I was in special pathogens. And it was amazing because when something happened around the world, people called us up and said, please, come help us. And what we did, though, when we went there is we shared all the information. We got clearances before we put things out. We had open discussions. And we tried to transfer, if there were new tests, new tools, we tried to transfer those to people. If you don't have that type of trust, we've lost that now because of all the politicization that occurred, it takes a really long time to rebuild it. And so for me, it's really going back to the basics, which is, every time a bill comes up and Congress says, oh, we'll just get rid of all the international things and we'll leave the domestic things because, America first, America can't be first in a world where you have to deal with a global issue. And so those small amounts of money that go into the international aspects are critical to build this trust and to have a system that is well done with people well trained. And by the way, it's also it's also personal. It's not about stepping in. It's about having, the phone numbers, knowing the people, going to conferences together, sharing, building the system so that when something goes bad, they call you up and say, hey, can you help me with this? Or what do you think about that? That informal networking really has to be there as well.
You mentioned the politicization of the pandemic. So going back in time, I was in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak at the time. I was working as an aid worker. They were in the middle of their own presidential elections in multiple countries there, and it very quickly got politicized. And so as I was reading the news of what was happening in China back in late December, early January, I was terrified because I could see this coming, given that we were in a presidential election year. How do we prevent that from happening? Is there anything we can do proactively?
Well, it really is about going back to the professionals in that circumstance. So I was sitting in Davos, which is where we dreamed up COVAX. President Trump was down the street saying, it's nothing, it's going to be one of the spring times, a few cases, nothing to worry about, forget about it. And I was sitting there with another expert, Richard Hatchett of CEPI, somebody who used to work at BARDA. And the two of us were saying, look, we don't know. Maybe this is just a dress rehearsal for the big one, but it doesn't look good from the news stories because we didn't have the actual real information. And we started to prepare at that point. Why? Because it didn't matter whether it was China or somewhere else. It was about a new disease that might be spreading, respiratory route, and had killed people. And that was enough to say this could be bad. that's what you need is a professional situation. And I understand politics, and they're always going to play in these circumstances, but it's even more important in an election year to make sure you let your professionals lead. Now, if you politicize the leaders of these institutions, then you have a problem also, because their loyalty will be more to the political leader or the party or whatever than it will be to the science. And that becomes a challenge, because you lose your credibility and trust very quickly when leaders say things that don't make any sense. The last thing I'd say that's really hard, and we need all of you to understand this, you don't know. We don't know in the beginning of a pandemic. And so you start off with a hypothesis. Sometimes you're right, and sometimes you're completely wrong. It doesn't mean that the science, isn't reliable. You don't have the information, you don't have the studies. And so what you have to do then is have a constant updating of this, and you have to have people understand that what was said yesterday could change the next day because of new knowledge, but it's transparent and it's not distorted and it's not, fake news. It is in reality the evolution of the knowledge about this particular agent. And so I think that also upset a lot of people, because they'd say, well, yesterday you said this and now you said this, and how does that do it? And that's, again, part of the education for people to understand. In the field of epidemics, pandemics, it's chaos on the front lines. You probably saw that in West Africa. The job is to get the data, to make sure the data is clean, and to be transparent about it. And if you don't do that and you just start, rumors, it's impossible to control these things.
Yeah. Going back to the early days of COVAX, what are some of the financial tools that could be put in place to make sure there's the funding available to respond immediately? I think some of what hampered COVAX initially was you had to raise the funds in order to put in the purchase orders, and by the time you had the funding, you were behind the US and the EU and other countries in line for vaccines.
That's absolutely true. So there's a number of lessons. The first one is really about risk. And this is a complicated one, because traditionally development agents are very risk averse. The UN is very risk averse. And during a pandemic, if you're risk averse, you got to step out of the way. I mean, it's just because, you're constantly, as I just explained, things are changing. You don't know what's happening. You got to do things at risk. You have to have no regret financing. So I will say that the donors were unbelievably good with us. I raised $12.5 billion for COVID, coming out of a fundraising of $10 billion for Gavi. So $22 billion over a course of, 18 months. But you're absolutely right, it was slow. Now, some donors let us use other money, transferred it over. We do have some innovative financing tools that can pre-fund things. But what we need is to have contingent financing. And the reason I'm saying contingent is we have a pandemic vaccine pool that right now has money in it from these donations. And as soon as the COVID got a little less severe, people began to say, well, how do we use it for this? How do we use it for that? They don't want idle money sitting around. And so I don't think we'll be in a situation where donors will give money and have it weighted for the future. But what you can do is create contingent financing. So in that circumstance, you have a pledge that says in an emergency, we will provide financing, and it could be over a number of years like we do with these IFM, International Funding Facility bonds. With that promise from donors, we can go to the capital markets and raise money, and we've raised about $10 billion over the last 20 years using that mechanism. If we had pre-existing promises from donors, then as soon as an outbreak hit, we could use our reserve funds, and we could then go to the capital markets and raise that money and get those queues started. Of course, it would take that risk tolerance, because this time, almost every vaccine we invested in, we had the largest portfolio, 11, worked. But imagine the next time, maybe 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 6 works, and then you end up wasting money. And this was what was so big about Operation Warp Speed, because they just said, we're investing, open treasury, whatever needs to get done. And again, they were able to accelerate because they just put their feet on the accelerator, didn't look back. That's what you have to do in a pandemic, and we need to do that for the world and not just for the United States. So those are some of the techniques and things that would need to be done. The last thing I'd say is we need surge. We need to be able to surge. Gavi has an overhead rate of 2.47%. So all of our donors say, wow, that's like great. It's wonderful. But when the pandemic hit, We had a great dedicated staff. They were, there was no fat in the system. They were working, around the clock. We were hiring every person we could get who was qualified, getting secundees. We were asking, consultancies to come help us because we had to go from the work we were doing to 193 countries, vaccine delivery systems, all these vaccines around the world, in a nanosecond. And it was very, very hard work.
And just to put that into context, an overhead rate of 2.4% is exceedingly low. I think for an NGO, it's maybe around 10% is more typical. Academia is 50 to 60%. So you didn't have a lot of slack.
That is correct. And the one other thing I'd say that we had to, there were 50 innovations we had to do. You'd think that the world was ready. The world wasn't ready. And sometimes they were silly little things. Let me give you an example. How do you label a vial in a pandemic? If you put it in the local language, then you can't use it somewhere else. So, is it a universal language? Do you have multiple languages? Do you have a barcode on it? And do you have barcode readers that then can translate what it is? Do you put an expiration date? When you have a new vaccine that's just been created novelly, you don't know how long it's going to last in the vial. So you start off saying, oh, it's good for 6 months, but that 6 months might actually extend to 2 years, and then you have to throw the vaccine out if you stamp the date on it. So we also had to create no-fault compensation schemes and indemnification and liability because manufacturers said, these are novel products, we need to be protected. So all of those lessons had to get learned, put in place, and some things really didn't work. We need to make sure we also say, this worked great, that didn't work at all. How do we go back now and figure out how to do that better next time?
What is the responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry in this context? I mean, after all, they benefit a lot, for example, from NIH funding at the basic science level. A lot of the research on mRNA vaccines was funded by NIH. Operation Warp Speed obviously gave quite a lot of funding to the pharmaceutical industry. What does corporate social responsibility look like in a pandemic?
It's an interesting question because to me, this is a different type of corporate social responsibility than saying, oh, we do things that are green and, we hire the right workforce and we do all of these issues. This is almost fundamental to the business model. It used to be, 100 years ago, vaccines were made by state facilities. And the decision was that industry can do it better. So basically, the state facilities mostly closed. There's a couple left. And now industry makes these products. So the question is then, does industry have a responsibility to make product for everybody? I would argue they do. Now, industry has been very good to us because we've worked with them for years. I told you the prices have dropped 98% for vaccines that we purchase. And so industry was willing to give us product, and they were willing to give us the best prices. So we ended up with the best prices everywhere. The challenge was there wasn't transparency on the order books. And this is something that has to be there in the future. Now, what does that mean and why is that important? So company X had a big manufacturing problem. And we know it's real because it was all over the news. They promised us 200 million doses of vaccine in 2021. They delivered 2.7 million doses. That's one of the reasons, another reason we were short. The question I have is, did they take all of their customers and cut them 98%, at which point you say that's fair? Or did they fill all the orders for their rich customers where they got a lot of money and then only cut the vaccines going to poor countries? If they did that, that is not fair. But I have no way to know that because their order books are confidential. I have a suspicion, given what I see in the news on what they're producing and putting out there, but we need to have that type of transparency. And that's very different from saying you need to have transparency for your formula or, what you're actually doing. I mean, I think, there are limits and companies protect their know-how, zealously, but they need to be in this circumstance when they are funded publicly, including also from public sector for developing countries. They need to be honest about what's actually happening.
One silver lining, if you can call it that, is coming out of the pandemic, there's a real renaissance in vaccine technology, vaccine development. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I don't know if everybody in this audience knows we have vaccines today against the largest killers of children, diarrhea and pneumonia. We have vaccines against many vector-borne diseases for the first time, parasite, malaria vaccines, and we have vaccines against cancer. We have 2 vaccines for hepatitis B and for HPV, for liver cancer and cervical cancer. During the pandemic, there were over 200 new vaccine efforts going on. Not all of them will finish, not all of them will come to fruition, but we have new technologies that can be used, and I would predict that we are likely to have lots more vaccines against cancers, against what we traditionally think are genetic or immune diseases, like things like juvenile diabetes or juvenile rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel diseases. You know, we don't know that those are caused by infections, but something triggers those, and it may be a combination of genomic susceptibility but also an infection. If we can figure that out, we have the tools today to make vaccines. So I think we'll be in a world where we can prevent more and more of disease. And of course, that's what we want. We want people to live a long and healthy lifespan, and I don't know, die in their sleep when they're 100, but not to have diseases that are chronic, and then you work on treating them, because prevention is always better than treatment. So I think that's where we'll be. And the challenge, of course, then is how do we have the systems in place and the financing in place to be able to make those available to the world's populations.
One last question, and then we'll take questions from the audience, so start thinking about what you want to ask. Gavi marked a really important milestone recently, 1 billion infants vaccinated by Gavi. How were you able to do that?
Well, a lot of hard work. Just to give you that statistic, on an annual basis, we vaccinate about half of the world's children. Not we. Countries vaccinate half the world's children using Gavi vaccines, but over the last 23 years, this is over 1 billion unique children, which means 1/8 of humanity is vaccinated by Gavi. But of course, we do a lot more vaccines. We don't give each child one vaccine, and so we actually estimate that it's been about 6 billion doses that we've provided. So we've probably ultimately vaccinated a larger percentage, a third, a quarter of humanity with Gavi vaccines. We don't know exactly, because you don't keep tabs on who gets an outbreak vaccine or who gets a COVID vaccine, who's gotten an infant vaccine as well. But that's why we've celebrated this as generation immunity, because this has been, 23 years. We're now vaccinating the children of people that are alive today because we vaccinated them as children at the beginning. So it's we've reduced vaccine preventable disease deaths by 73%. And that has contributed to a 50% reduction in child mortality, which is, an extraordinary thing.
Any questions? One question I'm going to, here.
On the topic of preparation for outbreaks of known diseases, right? It seems like you think about how to transport more efficiently, how to have more shelf-stable medicines, how to have simpler delivery mechanisms. And so in places like Africa, where you might not have as many medical practitioners, skilled nurses, et cetera, it seems like there's probably a trend towards making dealing with outbreaks simpler, easier, different delivery techniques, perhaps different formulations of medicines. Is one of the issues you've had to deal with what I'll call incumbent resistance from the vaccine manufacturers who make what's currently in use, and there's subtle and not subtle pressures to not change that?
So that's an interesting question. So first of all, the best way to prepare is to build those systems and deliver today's vaccine. So our core goal at Gavi is reaching 0-dose children. So I said about 90% of kids get routine access to one routine vaccine. The 10 that don't, 2/3 of them are below the poverty line, and 50% of child mortality occurs in that smaller number of children. So if we can reach those children, you put a woman health worker in touch with them, you build a surveillance system, because if there's a problem, they can know that. And that's really one of the key components as trying to move forward. We don't have problem with incumbents trying to block new vaccines. Of course, when you do have incumbents with vaccines, they often want their vaccines to be the global ones, and the ones with the big marketing departments will often, should I say, try to influence at the country level choices for vaccines. One last thing that's interesting is, we have a lot to learn, and you said, are we ready? And we're not. One of the challenges is when you have a disease that's known, like Ebola Zaire, we have a vaccine for. Ebola Sudan, we don't. And for Marburg, another terrible disease, mortality rate 70, 80%. But there was research. And the problem is the research vaccines, there's nobody there to pay to have those in a vial ready to go in an emergency. So we're going to the board on Monday, so I'm flying back on Friday to do this, to see if they'll permit us to set up what we're calling a global virtual pooled inventory of non-licensed vaccines that would be ready if there is an outbreak so they can get tested, and if they're shown to be efficacious, like in West Africa we showed efficacy, before you finally get them fully licensed, we would keep some of those strains around in case there was a big outbreak so you could use them in that circumstance. So these are some of the ways we're learning and trying to move forward. But I must say, I went to Uganda when we had this Ebola Sudan outbreak. It had spread to 9 districts, and it was in the capital city underground, and I thought, my God, this is going to be like West Africa. And at the end, the great public health team there brought it under control in 69 days, and the vaccine appeared day 78, so they couldn't test it. I mean, it was great that there now are vaccines in vials ready to go, but we don't know whether it works or not.
Other questions?
Hi there. I'm Shauna Butler. I'm one of the nurses, many of those millions of nurses who have been delivering vaccines. And one of the questions that I have is on that innovation on the workforce side. We're talking a lot about developing the vaccines, but it's vaccinations that are actually saving the lives. What kind of innovations do you see on workforce? And specifically, I'm thinking, like, how do we get to a place where we are having people in the community who are already there, who are trusted? How are we educating them to be vaccinators themselves?
It's a great question, Shauna. They're obviously for, you don't want an untrained person giving an injection in the muscle or whatever, because there's lots of complications that can occur with that. But there are new technologies. There are oral vaccines. Polio is an oral vaccine. There's inhaled vaccines we've used for flu. There are new patch technology, micro patches that you can push on the skin, and that acts, and you could send it via the postal system, or untrained health workers could use it. And so I would love to see a world where we would have these different tools available. Again, there hasn't been the financial drive, because the big companies, where the big money is, as we talked about, is going to be in single dose filled syringes, which by the way aren't great for the environment, but that they can charge a lot more for. And these other technologies may be more generally available. We're trying hard to push them using public sector dollars.
Here in the front, Gina.
Thanks very much. I'm a global health reporter, and I really appreciated what you were saying about learning from past pandemics. I was in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak then, too. One place it seemed to me that we didn't learn as much as we could have vis-a-vis the COVID vaccine was from the AIDS crisis. And I'm thinking in particular about the clamp down on intellectual property around vaccines and treatments and drugs. COVAX chose not to push pharmaceutical companies to be open about their IP, to quote-unquote share their recipe. And some people say that delayed the delivery of vaccines to the global south. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, why that choice was made, and if you'd do it differently if you had to do it again. So
thanks for that question. It's a very important question. And here's the reason. In the AIDS epidemic, which I was also involved with, it was drug treatments. Those are small molecules, and anybody in their garage can, I'm simplifying, but can make those drugs. What controls them are patents. And so the reason Nelson Mandela got sued was when he talked about compulsory licensing, it was about that intellectual property. Vaccines are not about intellectual property. They're about know-how. And the reason is that they're living things. So what you need to understand and bridge from the way a vaccine was made originally to produce that vaccine that was used in a clinical trial that showed efficacy, you got to show that you have the same product. You can't do that through a chemical formula. It has to be the process in each step of the process. So it's thousands of pages of steps, and that's what you need to hand over. Intellectual property is virtually irrelevant. I don't want to say there aren't maybe 1 or 2 steps that are patented, but if you don't have those 1,000 pages, you can't make the vaccine, certainly not in real time. And I actually think it was a tragedy during the pandemic that so many people got behind the, we need to have IP, because at the end, they won. There was a TRIPS waiver put in place, and IP was made available. It didn't bring any new vaccines. It didn't do anything. And so instead of the activists saying what we want to do during this period is make sure that there's transparency in companies, that countries are ready, that the vaccine misinformation is dealt with, they had this big argument on IP, which, as I said, they won, and we had the experiment. It didn't do anything. So that's why we weren't supporting it. If I believe that IP would lead to access, I'd be at the front of the line championing at that. But that was the reason we didn't support it.
Seth, do you have any final comments before we close?
Well, I just want to say that for everybody, I appreciate your being here. I think the challenge is vaccines are going to become not less important, but more important going forward. And what we need is a world where people have trust in them, and we have, truth to science. And this is going to be the critical issue if we want to take advantage of this amazing technology that has done more to save lives than virtually anything else, perhaps save water and sanitation. So it's been great to talk to all of you, and I'm here if you have any further questions. And thanks for the amazing interview.
Thank you, Seth.